everyone. My name is Felissa Tibbitts, and I am honored and delighted that I can be part of this symposium. I regret that I can't join you in person in Santiago, but I have been given the opportunity to address you virtually, and I hope that this will be a fruitful contribution to your deliberations on human rights education in Chile. So I'm going to share my screen now. Let me just, let's see, sorry. Sorry, it's a little slow. Here we go. So what I'm calling this presentation is the future of human rights education in Chile. As I understand, you're already doing some human rights education, but are thinking about renewing or strengthening what can be done in the country. So in order to make a contribution for your discussions, in my presentation today, I'm going to address two topics very briefly. I only have 15 minutes. One is the globalization of human rights education. Basically, it's an international movement. And what are some of the shared opportunities and challenges that we see across different country contexts, and perhaps also in Chile? And then I'm going to focus in just a little bit on human rights education within the Chilean context. I don't know a great deal about what is happening in Chile, but I know that there is already some human rights education and history education. And I'd like to sort of think out loud with you about what might happen next in regards to strengthening HRE. So a little bit on myself. I actually began in the civil society. I co-founded and directed Human Rights Education Associates. And about 10 years ago, and that was an organization that was dedicated to, basically training in human rights with adults. And about 10 years ago, I got my PhD. Some of you in the audience are in the process of getting your PhD. I did mine later in life. And then that led me to be a teacher educator with Columbia University. And I'm also currently still part-time chair in human rights education and UNESCO chair in human rights and higher ed at Utrecht University, which Daniela has already mentioned. In the context of working these past decades in human rights education, which has been difficult, it's been inspiring, it's been an amazing set of experiences for me, especially working with educators like you. I've had the opportunity to work on curriculum, on policy work, and also evaluations, all kinds of ways that you can be engaged in HRE. And I've done that with UNESCO, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, governments, and civil society organizations. So I feel like I have a great sort of reservoir of experience that I'm happy to share with you. Not so much in this presentation, it's too short, but in the future, moving ahead, I'm very happy to be in touch with those of you who would like to be in touch around human rights education curriculum or policy. Globalization of human rights education. So one of the things that's really self-evident now, scholarship is showing us that human rights, that topic, that language, is increasingly present in national curriculum and in textbooks. And the most recent scholarship on this, which came out in 2017, so a little less than 10 years ago, showed, for example, that human rights was in the national curriculum of 83 countries. I think that's gone up since 2017. And it's also in hundreds of titles in the education, used in the education sector. The Global Education Monitoring Report that UNESCO does also looks regularly for the human rights and also women's rights showing up in textbooks. Again, it's showing it very self-evidently in a national curriculum and associated resources. So this is a real change over the last 30 years. Of course, a question related to that, I'm going to intersperse different questions in the presentation today, is how in-depth human rights is actually being treated in the curriculum. I know, for example, in the United States, where the majority of states, because we're a federalist system, has human rights in the state curriculum, it's typically just restricted to the founding of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So just because human rights is in the national curriculum, it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily being used to its full potential, which I'll get to a little bit later in this presentation. Now, when we do find human rights education in national curriculum, maybe not surprisingly, we typically find it in the social sciences. So we find it in history, or European history specifically, or world history. in relation to the founding of the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Sometimes you find it in civics or citizenship education or related topics. There are some places where human rights is associated with well-being and it's infused into life skills. That's the case in South Africa, for example. But it's very rarely a transversal, meaning a cross-subject approach. Typically, it is the social sciences. So a question for us then, and maybe for you on Chile, would be, should it stay restricted to the social sciences? Is there potential for human rights, the human rights themes and the values to be integrated into other subject areas? And I also have a question for how it's treated in the social sciences these days in Chile. Does it actually address current issues, or is it primarily treated historically? So these are just a few things I'd like you to think about that maybe you can discuss after the presentation. Now, of course, we do have some big challenges for human rights education, and I sort of have two baskets for these challenges. They're not going to be unfamiliar to you, I think, those of you already involved in human rights education. The first challenge, of course, is the context of human rights itself. So maybe not in Chile, where I know that there's been a revival of looking at the period of the dictatorship and bringing to justice the perpetrators of those violations. So that's a very special environment now in Chile. But in other parts of the world, as you know, we have seen a rise in authoritarianism, a retreat from democracy, and alongside all of those, a shrinking civic space. So civil societies has been in some countries very much restricted, and that really affects the human rights in a country, especially the human rights discourse, because civil society and a vibrant civil society also engaged with human rights is really important, not only for the national discourse, we're thinking about human rights education in schools. There's also sort of wider critiques of human rights, which again, you're probably familiar with. The longstanding critique that it's claiming universality where cultures are very specific, where it's based also on Western ways of thinking and individualism, that human rights is a project of imperialism. So these are also critiques of human rights, which we could debate, but certainly in some contexts are used to diminish the potential of using human rights as an accountability mechanism towards governments. So the context of human rights is one of the main challenges, with some variations, again, country to country. The context of education is also a kind of challenge for human rights education, the main culprit being a lack of space in the curriculum. And those of you who are educators, I'm sure you understand this problem where you have a new topic, a theme. Where do you put it in the curriculum? It's already full of subjects and requirements. The increased standardization and assessment of education, for example, makes it even more, restrictive at times for introducing new themes for those related to human rights. So that's a key problem inside the education sector in general. Plus, there are many teachers who feel that human rights is a political term. It's associated with a certain political party. That if they start talking about human rights, especially in terms of current events, they're going to be seen as trying to politicize students. And moreover, many teachers just feel reluctant to talk about sensitive issues that could come up when you talk about human rights, and not feeling equipped to deal with sensitive or controversial topics might also make them reluctant to address human rights, so-called human rights in the classroom. So those are two of the main challenges in the context of education. So a related question then for all of us, I think, is if we do want to have really vibrant and strong, thick human rights education in the classroom, how can teachers be supported at the classroom level for doing that? And for example, in some places, it's having increasing teachers' capacities to address sensitive or controversial issues that can be an assistance for implementing HRE. But I'll get into some of those supports in just a little bit. So just a moment. So ideal conditions for human rights education. So this actually speaks to some of the supports. And again, these are generalities. So you'd have to think about what's the context for Chile and how these may or may not be already in place. One is that there is an explicit place in the national curriculum where human rights is mentioned. Apparently, it's already in history education. Maybe it could also be in citizenship education. Maybe there's other strategies you might have, but it needs to be in the national curriculum so teachers feel comfortable talking about human rights, not only maybe in the spaces that have been created inside the national curriculum, but also in other ways, which I'll mention it, I'll get to in just a little bit. Human rights education, also the ideal conditions that it's not just about content knowledge. And there can be, it's not that it's simple, but it's simpler to think about human rights in a primarily content-oriented manner, because there is a lot of information. It's about the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, international and regional human rights standards. There's a lot there to learn. How does the UN work? And what are the systems of accountability, etc. But yet, if we restrict ourselves to just learning about the content, then we lose the opportunity to think about human rights as a vibrant, alive value system that can be used to reflect on the life of the school, the life of the classroom, the life of the community. Because human rights education is not just about content, it's also about values and attitudes. So it's not only about thinking about values and attitudes in the school setting, but also values and attitudes that would make us all motivated to know and care about human rights and to protect and promote our human rights and the human rights of others whose human rights are being oppressed in any setting that we can think of. So the values and attitudes piece, very important. And also, finally, being motivated to do something for human rights. It doesn't mean that our learners need to be willing to go out on the streets and march in favor of human rights, but certainly to be predisposed to be an ally for those who are working for human rights, not to be a bystander when there's human rights issues at stake in violation. So basically, having human rights education with the cognitive, the values, the skills and behavior is consistent with this gold standard of human rights education, which we find in the UN Declaration on Human Rights Education and Training, where human rights education is referred to as being about human rights, through human rights, which speaks to the pedagogy and the culture of how human rights is offered and learned and practiced in the school setting, but also for human rights, meaning that there's something left over after human rights learning, again, motivation, and maybe some capacities to promote and protect human rights. So again, another ideal condition, moving to the third one here on the slide, is that teachers have freedom to create and extend human rights lessons. So if you have a sort of a foothold for human rights in the national curriculum, combined with an educational system where there is some space for teachers to play, maybe it's in the homeroom class, maybe it's in a more flexible curriculum like humanities or literature, where teachers can use some of their creativity to bring in human rights related themes or values. This is also an ideal condition for human rights education. That means not only space in the curriculum, it also means that teachers also have capacities to develop their own lessons. And hopefully in Chile, you're in an environment where teachers, when they're in training, learn about how to do lesson plans, learn how to use digital resources, bring in guest speakers, to use creative methodologies. Not all school systems are organized as such, but hopefully it is the case in Chile, and that is also an ideal condition for human rights education. Of course, we also have the typical system supports that are necessary for human rights education, as well as for any other kind of educational approach in the school sector, including teacher training, pre-service, in-service, learning resources to support human rights education, and assessment supports. And there's two kinds of assessment supports I want to mention here. The first are classroom-based assessment supports that would help a teacher implementing human rights education to be able to capture authentic learning that goes beyond just cognitive knowledge, like understanding a student's ability to carry out research or a project related to the application of human rights values inside the school setting. How do you assess that? So project-based learning assessment, for example, or integrating learner-centered education, so that maybe assessment involves peer assessment as a kind of a reflection of the values of human rights and participation, which is also very important for youth. So that's one element of assessment supports. Another assessment support is that if there's any kind of national exams, that there we find some reference to human rights. Even if it's a limited one, it sends a signal to teachers that human rights are important to be learned in the classroom, and that could be very helpful for promoting, again, the overall environment, in this case, for human rights education. Finally, another ideal condition for human rights education is something I'm going to call the whole school approach. And I hope that you already know something about this, but basically it draws our attention to the importance of thinking about human rights education, not only in terms of teaching and learning in the classroom, as important as that is, because we're focused, we as educators, on curriculum and pedagogy, but thinking about what also happens outside the classroom in the school setting. So that can include, for example, non-formal education, clubs. It could also include participation of the youth in decisions that influence them in the school environment. These are just some examples. So they're not just tokenistic participation of students on the student council, but let's say the student council, or there's maybe direct referendums with young people in the school so that they can influence those with authority to make decisions that influence their well-being in the school. Also, a whole school approach looks at partnerships. So it could be not only partnerships with the families of those who are learners in the school setting, but municipal authorities locally, or civil society actors in the local setting as well. This is all part of a whole school approach, but thinking of beyond teaching and learning in the classroom. And finally, it's not here, it's at the bottom here, supports from civil society, very, very key. It's often our human rights NGOs that sort of keep us true to the course, if you will, of human rights. And they can be a valuable partner for schools, for Ministry of Educations. In other countries I've worked in, civil society organizations have helped to create national curriculum. They've also, at the local level, been partners with schools as coming in as guest speakers, offering opportunities where students can do research and activities. So these are all absolutely ideal conditions for human rights education to think about, and hopefully you have many of these already in place in Chile. Okay, I'm moving to my next slide. So I do want to recognize that there are other approaches that are not exactly the same as human rights education, but are very much aligned in terms of thinking about, working towards a world, a society that's based on values of justice, of peace and coexistence, of global citizenship, of environmental responsibilities. So these various approaches that you can see on your screen are all endorsed by UNESCO, which I worked with a lot in the past. Global citizenship education, education for sustainable development, climate change education now also, peace and coexistence. These are all approaches that have a life inside of UNESCO and perhaps also in the Chilean school system, I'm not sure. And my own philosophy about these other approaches is that if those approaches, any of them, are the umbrella approach that is being used in the schooling system, then human rights can be brought alongside that into the schooling system, accompanying it, because global citizenship education, peace, ESD, they all have very strong human rights elements. There's a pillar of each of those that relates to human rights. If you flip it, if you have human rights education or human rights as your main umbrella, inside of that, you can bring in peace and coexistence, ESD, climate change, global citizenship. So my own philosophy, it's a very pragmatic one, is to by and large work with any of these frames that already has a strong foothold in your education system and bring in human rights. Or again, flipping it, if human rights is there, maybe you can bring in some of these other elements because the values are all shared. Their pedagogical approaches are very, very similar. And there's it's a real problem, like which of these approaches do we use when we have limited space for bringing in these kinds of transversal themes? But I know you have human rights education already in the Chilean system. I don't know if you have any of these other approaches also underway there, but think about linking these up. I think this is something also to consider as a way to strengthen HRE as well as these other approaches. Now, I do want to mention that there are special considerations for human rights education in countries like Chile that have a violent past. So there are other countries as well in which human rights education becomes maybe even introduced for the first time in the aftermath of a violent past. There are many special considerations. There's actually been research on this. The research is sometimes characterized as research of education in transitional justice environments. So research has shown, and Anja Mir is a German academic who's looked a lot at TJ environments, and her research has shown that usually around 20 years needs to pass before an educational system is ready to actually address this violent past in the national curriculum. And the reasons why it can take so long is because those issues need to be worked out in the political and the public domain before they can come into education. It's not usually ministries of education that are boldly going forward to take on these difficult histories. They can't do it typically without having these issues somehow resolved, a sort of an agreement about what are the facts and who is responsible, etc. So typically 20 years has to pass for these reasons. The other research that I wanted to share with you, there's other research on TJ environments, but the other I want to share with you is that the research associated with truth commissions, and those truth commissions are typically set up, right after, there's a shift out of this, say, dictatorship, or a truth commission after widespread abuses of citizens by their own governments. The truth commissions have shown that there's value in the truth telling, so that even if not everyone is brought to justice, the truth telling process itself is really an important process for a society to undergo. It helps with the healing. It promotes, at least it moves us closer to this idea that justice is possible. So, and this truth telling is something that can also be incorporated into eventually a national curriculum that is dealing with a difficult past. So, what I'd like to also highlight here are a few different approaches we can find in countries with violent pasts for addressing human rights. So one, and these may be familiar to you, I don't know. The first at the top is the one I kind of started to talk about a little bit, which is called a cosmopolitan approach to history teaching. So if we are going to be including the violent past, our own country's difficult past, in the United States, that's slavery, that's indigenous peoples, it's Japanese internment during World War II. I mean, it's, in our case, there's a kind of a sort of a litany and an emerging set of topics. But in any case, when we're dealing with our difficult pasts, it should be in such a way that the history pedagogy is, for example, using different perspectives, so that there's a kind of, it's encouraging critical thinking. It's not changing the facts, but it's encouraging multi-perspectivity and critical analysis, storytelling, so using different kinds of sources of information, use of primary sources, of course, whenever possible. So those of you who are history teachers, I know there's some of you in the room, will already be probably familiar with this, what's called the cosmopolitan approach. So this is also something that's often done when trying to think about difficult pasts and bringing that opportunity in, so that we can also think critically about justice and human rights and so forth. In some country contexts, moving to the proxy case bubble here, in some countries, it may be even too sensitive still to talk about what happened. And so in those interim periods, maybe before that 20-year mark has passed, although that's not a firm mark at all, you might look at case studies elsewhere where there's similar kinds of issues that happened, whether it was genocide or if it was dictatorship with mass violations of human rights in the country. So it could be that you look at other case studies from elsewhere, maybe even in the same region, and maybe inside the classroom connections can be made with your own history. But this is also a way for enabling an education system to address a difficult past at a time when it may not be still completely vetted around what happened in the country and what can be included in the history textbooks. In some cases, now moving to the guidance for teachers on addressing conflict, some cases, of course, conflict is still happening in a country. And as a consequence of this, teachers need to have some guidance on how to address the conflict itself, if it's going to come up in classroom discussions. But also it could be, and like I worked a little bit with the UN in Palestine, and there was a lot of students coming into the classroom, very aggressive, a lot of violence happening in the school setting because the students were witnessing so much violence. There was a lot of violence in the environment around them. So teachers also might need some assistance, not only the teachers, but in generally the school system for addressing violence coming up in the school setting. This is something that also, again, is very specific for countries that have a violent past or maybe even a violent present. But the final point I want to make here before I wrap up is that I really encourage you in Chile and any place that's had a history that lends itself for us to think about human rights, to not leave it restricted to talking about what happened historically, because the potential for human rights and human rights education can offer this is to think about human rights as a values framework. It doesn't dilute the importance of thinking about accountability, legal measures for those who have perpetrated human rights violations historically or in the present. Not at all. But if we want human rights to sort of come home for our students and our teachers and their families, then I think we need to be thinking about human rights as a value system. When I'm doing human rights education, when I'm training teachers myself, I encourage or invite them to think about human dignity as the core, as sort of the core of human rights education. Our role as educators and as human rights educators is to promote the human dignity of all in the classroom and in the school and our wider society. And it's funny, when you say human dignity, I feel like for myself, I kind of instinctively have a feeling about what that means. And human rights is about human dignity. So if we think about human dignity in the school setting, then we can think not only about learning about the past, but we can think about how we treat one another. We can think about injustices in the society that are present that might be addressed, problems of bullying in the school if it's there. So, but also not just thinking about problems, but thinking about the positives, like human rights values having to do with non-discrimination and inclusion and acceptance and gender equality. So I do encourage you to move beyond a violations approach to human rights and to explore whatever that might look like in the Chilean environment. So what's next for you? I'm not sure. I know you already have the integration of human rights within history education. Perhaps there is more you can do curricular-wise. I would be excited to hear that might be the possibility. Perhaps you can think about a transversal, multidisciplinary approach to human rights, thinking of it more holistically, again, as a value system, the human rights-based approach to schooling. If you've got global citizenship education happening, making sure that human rights is a piece of that. I really invite you to be creative in your thinking about what happens next, and very happy to again be with you today and to be able to share some of these initial thoughts, and wishing you all the best as you move forward.